My name is Cassidy, and I am 32 years old. For my 32nd birthday, my grandfather handed me a folded check for $60,000 with a trembling hand. Before I could even thank him, my brother locked the door, trapped me against the wall, and screamed at me to hand it over. When I refused, he slapped me across the face so hard my vision blurred. "Hand it over or I am calling the police," my sister-in-law sneered from the hallway. I managed to escape and drove straight to the bank. But when the branch manager scanned the check, his face went completely pale. "Ma'am," he whispered, "you need to call the authorities right now. Before I share exactly how I sent them all to federal prison, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you love seeing greedy family members get exactly what they deserve." The air inside my parents' upscale Chicago home always felt heavy, but tonight it was absolutely suffocating. It was supposed to be a simple dinner to celebrate my 32nd birthday. Down the hall in the grand dining room, my parents, David and Susan, were entertaining their wealthy friends, clinking crystal wine glasses and laughing loudly. I had slipped away from the noise to check on my grandfather, Winston. He is 82 years old, and for the past 8 months, my family has insisted he is suffering from severe dementia. They keep him isolated in his dark mahogany study at the back of the house, treating him like a fragile, mindless burden who cannot even hold a basic conversation. I quietly pushed open the heavy oak door of the study. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp. Winston sat in his worn leather recliner, staring blankly out the window into the dark backyard. The classical music playing softly from the hallway barely masked the tension radiating from the walls of this house. I walked over and gently placed a hand on his shoulder, expecting him to look at me with the same vacant expression he had shown everyone else all evening. Instead, something incredible happened. The moment my fingers touched his shoulder, his posture changed. The frail, confused old man vanished. Winston turned to look at me, and his eyes were sharp-focused and completely lucid. He checked the doorway behind me to ensure we were alone. Before I could ask how he was feeling, he reached into the inner pocket of his tweed cardigan and pulled out a crisp, neatly folded piece of paper. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was shocking. It was not the weak, trembling hold of a sick man. It was urgent and desperate. He pressed the piece of paper directly into my palm and curled my fingers tightly around it. I looked down and slowly unfolded the slip. It was a bank check, made out directly to me, Cassidy. My eyes scanned the numbers written in his familiar, precise handwriting. $60,000. I gasped quietly, my heart instantly hammering against my ribs. I am a forensic accountant by trade. I look at massive corporate accounts and trace complex financial anomalies all day for a living. I am used to dealing with huge sums of money that do not belong to me. But seeing a personal check for $60,000 from a man my family claimed could not even remember his own middle name sent a cold shockwave straight down my spine. This was not right. Nothing about this situation made any logical sense. "Grandpa, what is this?" I whispered, keeping my voice as low as possible so the guests in the dining room would not hear. I tried to hand it back to him. "You cannot give me this. David and Susan monitor all your accounts. Trent manages your entire portfolio. They will completely lose their minds if they see you writing checks." Winston refused to take it back. He pushed my hand away and leaned in close. His breath was shallow, but his words were deliberate and terrifyingly clear. "Listen to me very carefully, Cassidy," he whispered. "I do not have much time before they come looking for you. You need to take this check. Put it in your pocket right now and do not let anyone in this house see it." I stared at him, paralyzed by the sudden shift in his demeanor. The man sitting in front of me was not suffering from dementia. He was terrified. I quickly folded the check and shoved it deep into the pocket of my dress. "Tomorrow morning you go straight to the main bank branch downtown," Winston instructed, his voice dropping to a harsh, urgent rasp. "Do not go to any local branch. Go downtown. You find Mr. Mitchell. He is the branch manager. You hand this check directly to him, no one else. Do you understand me?" I nodded slowly, my mind racing through a dozen different terrifying scenarios. "Why, Mitchell?" I asked. "Why give me $60,000 right now? What is actually going on here?" Winston looked toward the closed door of the study, his eyes darting back to me with raw panic. "Just take it to Mitchell. He will know exactly what it means. And Cassidy, whatever you do, do not tell your parents. Do not tell your brother Trent. If they find out you have this, they will destroy you just to get it back. Run, Cassidy. When you get the chance tonight, just run." The sheer terror in his voice made my blood run cold. As a forensic accountant, my professional instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. A massive, unexpected sum of money handed over in secret, a specific bank manager named as the only point of contact, a grandfather faking a debilitating medical condition while living under the strict, suffocating financial control of his son and grandson. The pieces were forming a very dark, very dangerous picture. I knew my brother Trent had taken over as Winston's self-appointed wealth manager last year. Trent drove a brand new luxury sports car and lived in a penthouse despite having a mediocre client list. I opened my mouth to ask Winston exactly what Trent was doing with his retirement funds. I needed details. I needed to know exactly what kind of financial mess I was walking into before I took this check to the bank. But I never got the chance to ask. Before I could utter a single syllable, a heavy shadow fell across the sliver of light under the study door. The loud chatter from the dining room suddenly felt very far away. Someone was standing right outside the room listening to us. Winston instantly slumped back into his leather recliner, his sharp gaze dissolving back into the vacant, confused stare of a dementia patient. His chin dropped to his chest and his hands began to tremble artificially. The transformation was so fast and so flawless it took my breath away. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my hand instinctively dropping to cover the pocket where the $60,000 check was hidden. The silence in the study was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own rapid breathing and the loud thudding of my pulse in my ears. I took a slow step backward, putting a safe distance between myself and my grandfather to make it look like I was just checking on him. Then the heavy brass doorknob began to rattle. It did not turn smoothly or politely. It rattled violently with aggressive, impatient force. Someone was grabbing the handle, twisting it hard, preparing to shove their way into the room and catch us. The wooden frame groaned loudly under the sudden weight of whoever was standing on the other side. My brother Trent was notoriously impatient, and I knew exactly what was about to happen. The door was about to fly open, and my family nightmare was officially about to begin. The heavy oak door burst inward with a deafening crack. The brass handle slammed against the drywall, leaving a deep dent in the expensive wallpaper. Trent stood in the threshold. My older brother was wearing his custom-tailored Italian suit, his tie slightly loosened, and his face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. He stepped into the dimly lit study and immediately reached behind him, turning the deadbolt with a sharp, metallic click. The sound echoed in the quiet room, sealing us inside. "What do you have in your pocket, Cassidy?" he demanded. His voice was not the polished, charming tone he used out in the dining room with his wealthy clients. It was a guttural, venomous command. I kept my hands firmly at my sides, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I do not know what you are talking about," I replied, fighting to keep my voice steady. "I am just checking on Grandpa. He looked lonely sitting in here all by himself." "Do not play stupid with me," Trent snarled, closing the distance between us in 3 long strides. He pointed an accusing finger directly at my face. I heard the tear of the checkbook. I know exactly what the old man just did. He is out of his mind. He is completely senile. That money does not belong to you. That cash is strictly allocated for his management portfolio, a portfolio that I oversee. My forensic accountant instincts flared instantly. Wealth managers do not panic over a single check unless the underlying accounts are dangerously illiquid or hiding massive discrepancies. Legitimate portfolios have buffers. Legitimate portfolios are transparent. Trent was sweating. The vein in his neck was visibly pulsing. This was not the reaction of a responsible financial advisor protecting a client. This was the raw panic of a desperate man trying to plug a leaking dam. "If you are managing his portfolio so well, Trent, A $60,000 withdrawal should not send you into a complete meltdown, I challenged, standing my ground. Unless, of course, the money is not actually where you say it is. Trent's eyes widened with a mix of shock and unhinged fury. He grabbed me by the shoulders, slamming my back against the bookshelf. The heavy hardcover books rattled against the wood. "Give me the check right now!" he screamed, his grip digging painfully into my skin. "He does not know what he is doing. He is a sick, confused old man, and you are taking advantage of his rotting brain." I looked over at Winston. My grandfather had slumped entirely sideways in his leather recliner. His eyes squeezed shut, performing the role of a helpless, oblivious dementia patient flawlessly. He was leaving this entirely up to me. I had to protect that piece of paper. It was the only tangible evidence I had. "Get your hands off me," I shouted, shoving my forearms hard against his chest to break his grip. "I am not giving you anything." Trent lost whatever shred of control he had left. He drew his hand back and swung. The slap was brutal. His heavy palm struck the left side of my face with a sickening smack. The sheer force of the impact snapped my head to the side, throwing my equilibrium entirely off balance. I stumbled backward, my hip crashing hard against the edge of the mahogany desk. A high-pitched ringing pierced my left ear, and the sharp metallic taste of copper instantly flooded my mouth. I touched my trembling fingers to my split lip, staring at my brother in absolute disbelief. He had just struck me. Before I could even process the physical shock, the deadbolt clicked again. The door swung open and the suffocating tension in the room thickened. My sister-in-law Nia stepped effortlessly into the doorway. She looked immaculate, dressed in a sleek designer gown, her flawless makeup entirely undisturbed by the violence that had just occurred. Nia was a high-powered real estate broker, sharp, calculating, and completely ruthless. As a successful African-American woman in the competitive luxury housing market, she projected absolute authority, but behind closed doors, she used that same commanding presence to belittle anyone she deemed beneath her. Nia did not look horrified by the red mark spreading across my cheek. She did not ask if I was okay. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest, planted her expensive heels firmly in the doorway to block my only exit, and let out a cold, mocking laugh. "You really should just hand it over, Cassidy," Nia sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. "Look at yourself. A broke, glorified calculator still paying off student loans does not deserve a dime from this family. You think you are so smart with your little forensic accounting degree, but you are nothing but a hired bean counter." I wiped the blood from my lip, glaring at her. "You have no idea what is going on here, Nia." "Oh, I know exactly what is going on," she fired back, her voice dripping with venom. "You are a jealous, pathetic failure who cannot stand watching your brother succeed. Trent has built an empire. He handles millions. And you live in a cramped apartment crunching numbers for other people's businesses. You are a loser, Cassidy. You always have been. Now reach into that cheap dress of yours and give my husband the check." I straightened my posture, ignoring the throbbing pain in my jaw. "No, I am taking this to the bank." Nia pulled her latest model smartphone from her designer clutch and held it up, her perfectly manicured fingers hovering over the screen. "Give it up, or I am dialing 911 right now to report you for elder theft," she threatened, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "I will tell the police you manipulated a senile old man into giving you his life savings. Who do you think they will believe, the successful wealth manager and the prominent real estate broker, or the struggling, desperate daughter trying to rob her own sick grandfather? You will be arrested before you even reach the end of the driveway." The threat was incredibly real. They had the social standing, the wealth, and the perfect family facade to make a false police report stick. They had already convinced the entire neighborhood and our parents that Winston was severely mentally compromised. If the police arrived right now, they would see a confused elderly man, a frantic wealth manager claiming fraud, and a woman holding a massive unexplained check. It was a perfectly laid trap, constructed by two people who clearly had entirely too much practice manipulating the truth. I looked at Trent, his chest heaving as he stood ready to physically assault me again. I looked at Nia, her thumb resting maliciously over the call button on her phone, ready to ruin my life and my professional career with a single false accusation. They thought they had me completely cornered. They thought my fear of confrontation and my lack of financial power would force me to submit just like it always had when we were growing up. But they severely underestimated the situation. They forgot that I analyze desperate criminals for a living. I know exactly how panicked fraudsters behave when their crimes are on the verge of exposure. I tightened my grip on the paper hidden safely in my pocket, preparing to do the only thing I could do. I did not cry. In the past, the stinging pain in my jaw and the terrifying hostility from my brother would have broken me. I would have collapsed, surrendered the check, and begged for forgiveness just to stop the conflict. But the woman standing in that study was not the frightened little girl they used to bully. I was a professional who spent her days dismantling the lies of corrupt executives. And right now, the two people blocking my exit were nothing more than desperate criminals trying to cover their tracks. Trent shifted his weight, his eyes locked on my pocket. He lunged forward, reaching out with both hands to grab me by the throat. Time seemed to slow down. I did not step back. Instead, I grabbed the heavy solid oak chair positioned next to my grandfather's desk. Using every ounce of strength I possessed, I swung my body weight behind it and kicked the chair violently into Trent's path. The heavy wood collided directly with his shins with a loud, sickening crack. Trent let out a sudden howl of agonizing pain. His forward momentum carried him right over the seat of the chair, and he crashed hard onto the hardwood floor, clutching his legs and cursing fiercely. That gave me exactly 2 seconds. I spun toward the doorway where Nia was still blocking the exit. Her smug, victorious smile instantly dissolved into absolute shock. She opened her mouth to scream, holding her phone up like a shield, but I did not stop running. I lowered my shoulder, braced myself, and slammed my body forcefully against hers. Nia shrieked as the impact threw her off balance. Her expensive smartphone flew out of her hand, shattering against the corridor wall. Her stiletto heels twisted on the polished floorboards, and she crashed into the doorframe, desperately grabbing at my dress to stop me. I ripped myself free from her clutching fingers, tearing the fabric of my sleeve, and bolted out of the study. I sprinted down the long carpeted hallway of my parents' mansion. My pulse was pounding a frantic rhythm in my ears. Behind me, I could hear Trent scrambling to his feet, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floor as he bellowed my name. "Get back here," he roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Catch her! Do not let her out of the house!" I rounded the corner into the grand foyer, slipping slightly on the imported marble tiles. The lavish birthday dinner was still happening just a few feet away in the formal dining room. The sudden commotion from the hallway caused the polite chatter and the clinking of crystal glasses to abruptly cease. A dozen wealthy, well-dressed guests turned their heads to stare at me. I knew I looked like a complete disaster. My hair was disheveled, my dress was torn, and fresh blood from my split lip was smeared across my chin. Before I could reach the heavy double doors at the front entrance, my mother stepped directly into my path. Susan was holding a glass of expensive red wine, her face a mask of absolute horror and fury. She did not look at my bleeding face. She did not ask if I was hurt. Her only concern was the spectacle I was making in front of her high society friends. "Cassidy, what on earth are you doing?" my mother hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the dining room. She reached out and clamped her manicured hand tightly around my forearm, her nails digging into my skin. "Stop running around like a lunatic. You are ruining a perfectly good evening. People are staring at you." "Let go of me, Mom!" I demanded, my voice sharp and unwavering. I tried to pull my arm away, but her grip was surprisingly strong, fueled by her desperate need to control the optics of the situation. "You are embarrassing this family," she whispered furiously, stepping closer to block the front door. "I do not know what kind of tantrum you are throwing this time, but you will march back down that hallway and apologize to your brother right now." I could hear Trent sprinting down the corridor, his angry footsteps getting closer by the second. I had no time to explain the massive financial fraud to a woman who would blindly side with her golden son anyway. I yanked my arm back with a violent jerk, breaking her hold. Some of her red wine sloshed over the rim of her glass, staining the pristine white rug beneath our feet. My mother gasped in outrage, but I was already throwing my weight against the heavy front door. I burst out into the cool, damp night air. The sudden chill was a sharp shock to my system. My reliable 10-year-old sedan was parked at the very end of the circular driveway, completely out of place among the rows of Mercedes and BMWs belonging to their guests. I sprinted down the driveway, my heels slapping loudly against the pavement. I dug my hand into my purse, blindly searching for my car keys. My fingers brushed against the metal just as I heard the front door of the mansion crash open behind me. Cassidy Trent screamed into the night. I reached my car, jammed the key into the lock, and threw the door open. I slid into the driver's seat, instantly slamming my hand down on the power lock button. All four doors locked with a reassuring click, just a fraction of a second before Trent slammed his body against the side of my vehicle. He beat his fists violently against my driver's side window. His face was contorted with unhinged animalistic rage, his features illuminated by the harsh glow of the outdoor security lights. He pounded on the glass so hard I feared it might shatter, screaming threats that verified every dark suspicion I had about his financial crimes. "Open this door right now," Trent roared, his breath fogging up the glass. "If you take that check, I will destroy your life. I will bury you. You are dead to this family. Do you hear me? Open the door." I did not flinch. I did not look away. I stared right back at his desperate, sweating face through the smudged glass. My hands were perfectly steady as I pushed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine roared to life. Trent grabbed the door handle, yanking it frantically, screaming a string of vicious curses as he realized he had lost control of the situation. I shifted the car into reverse, stomped on the gas pedal, and the tires squealed against the asphalt. The sudden movement forced Trent to jump back to avoid being pulled under the wheels. I whipped the steering wheel around, shifted into drive, and sped straight down the tree-lined street. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time and saw my brother standing alone in the middle of the driveway, shaking his fists at my receding taillights. I was safely away, the $60,000 check burning a hole in my pocket, and I knew exactly where I was going next. I drove for miles without a specific destination, letting the chaotic adrenaline slowly bleed out of my system. The glaring streetlights of the affluent suburbs eventually gave way to the towering steel and glass silhouettes of downtown Chicago. I pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour parking garage, backed into a corner spot, and locked the doors. My grandfather had been very clear. I needed to go to the main branch downtown tomorrow morning. I spent the remainder of the night, sitting perfectly still in the driver's seat, my hand resting over the pocket that held the $60,000 check. Sleep was entirely impossible. My forensic accounting brain was already dissecting every interaction, every word my brother had screamed, and every panicked look my mother had thrown my way. They were hiding a massive financial crime, and this piece of paper was the key to exposing all of it. I watched the digital clock on my dashboard slowly tick forward. As the dark sky finally began to lighten into a pale, icy morning gray, I started the engine. The regional bank branch was an imposing fortress of polished granite and tinted windows dominating a busy corner of the financial district. I parked on the street just as the city was waking up, clutching my purse tightly against my side. At exactly 8 o'clock, a security guard unlocked the heavy glass double doors. I was the very first person to step inside. The massive lobby was pristine and quiet, filled with the faint hum of air conditioning and the soft clicking of keyboards as the tellers prepared for their shifts. A young woman at the front reception desk looked up with a welcoming, highly trained corporate smile. She opened her mouth to greet me, but I did not break my stride. I walked right past her desk, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor with absolute purpose. "Hey, miss," the receptionist called out, her voice pitching up with sudden alarm. "You need to wait in line. You cannot just go back there." I completely ignored her. I knew exactly how these flagship branches were laid out. The tellers handled the daily deposits, but the high-level executives and regional managers occupied the glass-walled offices lining the back perimeter. I marched straight toward the largest corner office. A brushed metal plaque beside the heavy glass door read Branch Manager Thomas Mitchell. This was the man my grandfather had specifically named. This was the man who held the answers. A security guard stepped into the hallway, raising a hand to intercept me. "Ma'am, this area is restricted. Do you have an appointment?" I sidestepped his outstretched arm with practiced agility and grabbed the heavy silver handle of the corner office door. I pushed it open and stepped inside before the guard could physically stop me. The office was immaculately organized. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was a man in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, custom-fitted suit. He had silver hair and the authoritative posture of someone accustomed to unquestioned compliance. Mr. Mitchell was in the middle of reviewing a stack of financial reports, a steaming cup of coffee resting near his elbow. He looked up, his brow furrowing in immediate irritation at the sudden intrusion. "Excuse me," Mitchell said, his tone dripping with professional annoyance. "This office is private. If you need assistance with an account, you must speak with a teller in the main lobby. You cannot simply barge in here." The security guard appeared breathless in the doorway behind me. "Mr. Mitchell, I am so sorry," the guard stammered. "She just walked right past the desk. I will escort her out immediately." I did not back down. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the folded piece of paper, and stepped directly up to the mahogany desk. "My grandfather told me to bring this directly to you," I said, my voice steady and commanding. "No one else. Just you." I slammed the $60,000 check flat onto the polished wood, right on top of his financial reports. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet office. Mitchell let out an exasperated sigh, clearly preparing to lecture me about bank protocol and security procedures. He raised a hand to signal the guard to step inside and remove me, but before he gave the order, his eyes flicked down to the piece of paper resting on his desk. I watched his reaction with the trained, calculating gaze of a forensic investigator. I expected him to look at the massive dollar amount first, as most people do. I expected him to question my identity or ask for a matching deposit slip. I did not expect what actually happened. The professional annoyance completely vanished from Mitchell's face in a fraction of a second. His jaw slackened. The color drained entirely from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly ashen pale. He leaned forward, his hands trembling slightly as he grabbed the edges of the check to pull it closer. He was not looking at the $60,000 amount. He was staring directly at the signature line. The silence in the office grew heavy and suffocating. Mitchell's eyes darted rapidly across the ink, scanning the specific way the letters were formed, analyzing the exact routing number printed along the bottom edge. His breathing hitched, shallow and erratic. He looked like a man who had just been handed a live explosive device. "Mr. Mitchell," the security guard asked uncertainly from the doorway. "Do you want me to call the police?" "No," Mitchell whispered. His voice was hoarse, entirely stripped of its former authority. He did not look away from the check. He swallowed hard, his chest heaving visibly as pure, unfiltered terror took over his features. "Leave us," Mitchell commanded the guard, his tone shaking. "Close the door. Do not let anyone disturb us under any circumstances." The guard hesitated, thoroughly confused by the sudden shift in atmosphere, but he eventually stepped back and pulled the heavy glass door shut until it clicked securely into place. We were completely alone. Mitchell slowly looked up at me. His eyes were wide with genuine fear. He looked at my torn dress, my disheveled hair, and the dark bruised split on my lip where my brother had struck me the night before. He recognized that I had fought a physical battle just to deliver this piece of paper to his desk. "You are Winston's granddaughter?" he asked, his voice barely a breath. "Yes," I replied, refusing to break eye contact. "My name is Cassidy. He told me to find you. He told me you would know exactly what this means." Mitchell slumped back heavily into his expensive leather chair, running a trembling hand across his face. He stared at the check again, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. The polished, confident banking executive was entirely gone, replaced by a man facing a monumental crisis. "You should not have brought this here," Mitchell whispered, his voice laced with dread. "You have no idea what you have just walked into." "I know exactly what I walked into," I countered, keeping my posture rigid despite the exhaustion clawing at my muscles. "I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Mitchell. My entire career is built on dismantling corporate fraud and tracking missing assets. I know my brother Trent is running a scheme. I know my grandfather is terrified and trapped inside his own house. What I do not know is why a prominent branch manager at a major financial institution looks like he is about to have a heart attack over a $60,000 check. Mitchell let out a shaky breath, running a hand through his silver hair. He picked up a heavy gold pen from his desk, gripping it so tightly, his knuckles turned white. He tapped the tip of the pen against the top left corner of the paper lying between us. "Look at the account routing information," he instructed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Read the entity name printed right above your grandfather's address." I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto the small, bold text. It did not say Winston's personal trust. It did not say anything related to the standard retirement portfolios my family openly discussed at holiday dinners. Instead, it read, Apex Holdings, LLC. That is not his personal account. I stated my professional instincts, immediately categorizing the anomaly. That is a corporate entity. It is a shell company, Mitchell corrected, his gaze darting toward the frosted glass of his office door, as if he expected Trent to smash through it at any moment. Apex Holdings was formed exactly 7 months ago. Your brother walked into this very office and presented a freshly minted power of attorney document. He claimed your grandfather was experiencing rapid cognitive decline and needed immediate wealth management intervention. Trent transferred a massive portion of Winston's liquid assets into this newly formed LLC under the guise of consolidating investments for tax purposes. I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. 7 months ago was exactly when my parents started aggressively pushing the narrative that Winston was suffering from severe dementia. The timing was a perfect calculated overlap. If Trent has power of attorney and controls the shell company, why did my grandfather write this check? I asked, pointing to the paper. And more importantly, how did he even get his hands on the physical checkbook? Mitchell leaned closer, his voice dropping an octave lower. Winston is not the senile old man your brother pretends he is. 3 weeks before Trent marched in here with those legal documents, your grandfather visited me privately. He brought his estate lawyer, Mr. Gallagher. Winston suspected Trent was planning to seize control of his finances. He knew Trent was drowning in debt and desperate for cash. But Winston also knew that if he fought Trent openly, your parents would blindly side with your brother and force Winston into a conservatorship. So Winston decided to play the long game. He let Trent take the bait. He let Trent set up the shell company. Mitchell paused, picking up the check and holding it up to the desk lamp. The bright light illuminated the dark blue ink of my grandfather's signature. "Look closely at his name," Mitchell said. I squinted at the cursive script. Winston had signed his full legal name perfectly, but right beneath the loops of his signature, he had drawn 2 distinct heavily pressed lines, a double underline. "It is a pre-arranged distress signal," Mitchell revealed, his tone thick with anxiety. When Winston and Mr. Gallagher sat in this office, they established a fail-safe protocol. Winston secretly kept one checkbook linked to the Apex Holdings account before Trent locked everything down. Winston told me that if he ever presented a check drawn from this specific account signed with a double underline, it meant he was in immediate physical danger and the financial trap was ready to be sprung. It meant Trent had crossed the line from simple mismanagement to active federal embezzlement. My breath caught in my throat. The gravity of the situation was staggering. My grandfather was not just a victim. He was a mastermind orchestrating a massive sting operation against his own grandson, and he had chosen me to deliver the final blow. "How much has Trent taken?" I demanded, my voice hardening. "Tell me the exact numbers." Mitchell turned toward his dual monitors, quickly typing in a sequence of passwords. He pulled up a complex ledger and spun the screen so I could see the devastating reality. "Your grandfather spent 40 years building a retirement fund worth just over $4 million, Mitchell explained, pointing to a rapidly declining graph on the screen. "Over the past 7 months, Trent has been slowly bleeding it dry. He is smart, I will give him that. He avoids triggering the automatic federal reporting thresholds by structuring the transactions. He moves money out of Apex Holdings in batches of $8,000 or $9,000, transferring the funds into offshore accounts or wiring them directly to third-party vendors. I stared at the screen, my forensic accounting background easily translating the fraudulent activity. Structuring is a classic money laundering technique. Trent was siphoning off Winston's life savings right under everyone's noses, using his authority as a wealth manager to mask the theft as legitimate business investments. He has drained almost $2 million already, Mitchell stammered, pointing to the bottom line of the ledger. If he continues at this aggressive pace, the entire $4 million fund will be completely liquidated by the end of the year. Winston will be left with absolutely nothing. Your parents will be left with nothing. Trent is destroying your entire family to line his own pockets. The sheer scale of the betrayal made my blood run cold. Trent was not just arrogant and spoiled. He was a ruthless, calculating criminal who was actively stealing millions from his own flesh and blood to fund his lavish, fake billionaire lifestyle. Before Mitchell could even lift his hand to grab the sleek black desk phone and dial the federal authorities, a sudden explosive commotion erupted out in the main lobby. The heavy, muffled thud of the bank front entrance flying open violently echoed through the thick, frosted glass of the corner office. Mitchell froze his hand, hovering just inches above the receiver. My professional training kicked in, analyzing the auditory cues before I even saw the physical threat. Sharp, angry footsteps stomped across the polished marble floor, moving with terrifying speed and unmistakable purpose. "We need to call the police right now," Mitchell stammered, his eyes widening as a loud, aggressive voice demanded immediate attention from the terrified receptionist. Before I could agree, the heavy glass door of the manager office was violently wrenched open, slamming against the doorstop with a deafening crash. Trent stormed into the room, his face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson. He was no longer trying to maintain his polished wealth manager facade. He looked entirely unhinged, breathing heavily like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. And he was not alone. Right behind him, pushing past the stammering security guard, were my parents. David and Susan marched into the executive office with identical expressions of righteous indignation and absolute fury. My mother was clutching her designer handbag so tightly, her knuckles were stark white. My father looked at me with a gaze so full of pure disgust, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. "I thought I turned off my location sharing," I muttered mentally, kicking myself as I instinctively took a step back, positioning myself strategically between Trent and the mahogany desk, where the $60,000 check still lay exposed. "You are still on the family cell phone plan, you idiot," Trent spat his eyes, locking instantly onto the folded piece of paper resting near Mitchell's coffee cup. "I tracked your GPS the second I realized you actually had the nerve to come here. I told you I would destroy you if you tried to cash that." David stepped forward, shoving his way past Trent to glare directly down at me. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute submission. "Cassidy, you will hand over that check this instant. I cannot believe you would stoop this low. Sneaking into your sick grandfather room in the middle of the night, manipulating a man whose brain is literally deteriorating just to line your own pockets. You are a disgrace to this family." Mr. Mitchell stood up from his chair, his hands visibly shaking, but he attempted to assert his authority as the branch manager. "David, please lower your voice. This is a secure financial institution. We are currently reviewing a highly sensitive transaction that Winston himself authorized." My mother let out a sharp theatrical gasp, clapping her hand over her chest, as if she had just been physically assaulted by the very idea. She turned her attention away from the private office and stepped deliberately back out into the open lobby. She knew exactly what she was doing. Susan thrived on public spectacle. She used social pressure and public humiliation as her primary weapons of control. If she could not bully me in private, she would destroy my professional reputation in public. "My own daughter is a thief!" Susan screamed, her shrill voice carrying effortlessly across the cavernous bank lobby. Every single teller stopped counting cash. Every customer waiting in line turned their heads to stare at the unfolding drama. Look at her. A grown woman, a so-called professional, preying on a helpless, senile old man who cannot even remember what he had for breakfast. I stepped out of the office, refusing to cower behind Mitchell. "Mom, stop this right now," I demanded, keeping my voice firm and authoritative. You are making a massive scene, and you do not understand the financial reality of what is actually happening here. Oh, I understand perfectly, David roared, joining my mother in the center of the lobby. He pointed an accusatory finger right at my face, ensuring every bystander in the building knew exactly who the villain was supposed to be. You have always been jealous of your brother. You have resented Trent for years because he is successful, because he handles high-level investments while you just crunch numbers in a cubicle. So you decided to sabotage his hard work. You decided to rob your own grandfather just to spite the son who actually takes care of him. The sheer audacity of the gaslighting was staggering. They were standing in the middle of a federal bank screaming that I was the criminal while Trent stood right behind them, actively attempting to cover up a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. The customers in the lobby began whispering among themselves. A few people pulled out their phones, their eyes darting between my disheveled appearance and my impeccably dressed, outraged parents. To an outside observer, the narrative was perfectly clear. I looked like a desperate, erratic woman who had just been caught red-handed committing elder abuse. Trent stepped out of the office to join my parents, playing the role of the exhausted, responsible caretaker to absolute perfection. He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, as if my actions were causing him immense personal pain. "Folks, I apologize for the disruption," Trent announced to the staring crowd, projecting his voice with practiced corporate charm. "My sister has been struggling with some severe emotional instability lately. She took advantage of our grandfather who suffers from advanced dementia. We are just trying to handle this family tragedy privately before she commits a serious felony." The manipulation was flawless. He was weaponizing the stigma of mental instability against me, validating my parents' outrageous claims, and painting himself as the heroic savior all at once. "He does not have dementia," I shouted, my professional restraint finally breaking. I pointed directly at Trent. "He is lucid, and he is terrified of you. That check is a distress signal because you are draining his retirement accounts into a shell company." My mother marched right up to me, invading my personal space. Her eyes were blazing with a manic, unyielding loyalty to her golden child. "Shut your mouth, Cassidy," she hissed, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper, meant only for me. "You are making a fool of yourself. Trent is executing complex tax strategies that a simple bookkeeper like you could never comprehend. He is protecting our family wealth. You are just a bitter, ungrateful girl who wants to steal a confused old man money to pay off your pathetic debts." I stared at the woman who gave birth to me, feeling a final irreparable fracture in my heart. Susan and David did not care about the truth. They did not care about forensic accounting routing numbers or wire fraud. They were entirely willing to sacrifice me to brand me a criminal in front of dozens of witnesses just to protect the polished, affluent facade that Trent provided for them. Mitchell emerged from his office clutching the $60,000 check tightly against his chest. He looked at the security guards who were now flanking the lobby doors, unsure of who they were supposed to detain. The tension in the air was absolute. My family had successfully cornered me in a public arena, attempting to use shame and intimidation to force my compliance. But as I looked at Trent's smug, victorious smile, I knew they had made a fatal miscalculation. They had brought a fight about financial fraud into a bank, assuming my fear of embarrassment would override my knowledge of the law. My mother took another aggressive step forward, her expensive perfume creating a suffocating cloud in the sterile bank lobby. "You have always been envious of Trent." Susan sneered, her voice carrying an edge of practiced theatricality designed to sway the onlookers. She gestured wildly toward my brother, who stood looking like a perfect, polished executive despite the chaos he had just caused. "Just because he drives a Porsche and you drive a 10-year-old junker does not give you the right to sabotage his tax-saving investments for your grandfather. Do you have any idea how hard your brother works to secure our family legacy? You are trying to ruin him out of pure bitter spite." I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer magnitude of her delusion. Tax-saving investments. The phrase was absolutely laughable. I looked around the lobby, making sure my voice was loud, clear, and perfectly steady. Mom transferring $4 million of liquid retirement funds into a newly formed offshore shell company. is not a tax-saving investment," I stated, enunciating every single syllable so the security guards and the bank tellers could hear me perfectly. "It is a textbook layering technique used in money laundering. He is stripping Winston of his life savings to pay off his own massive personal debts. That Porsche you are so proud of is financed by your own father's stolen retirement money." My father stepped in his face purple with outrage. "That is a disgusting, baseless lie," David roared. "Trent is an accredited wealth manager. He is restructuring the portfolio to avoid heavy estate taxes. You are just a glorified bookkeeper who cannot stand the fact that your brother makes more in a month than you make in a year. You have always tried to tear him down to make yourself feel better about your own pathetic life. You dropped out of our social circle, you refused to join the family firm, and now you show up here looking like a maniac to steal from a sick old man." While my parents continued their loud vitriolic character assassination, Trent realized that screaming in a federal bank was a terrible strategy for a man actively committing financial fraud. He needed to de-escalate the public spectacle immediately before someone actually called the police and triggered an official inquiry. I watched him smoothly pivot, his face instantly transformed from a mask of violent rage into an expression of deep, exhausted sorrow. He turned his back on me and walked slowly toward the two armed security guards who were standing near the exit observing the chaos with their hands resting cautiously on their radios. "Officers, I am so incredibly sorry for this disruption," Trent said, his voice dropping into a smooth, comforting, and highly persuasive baritone. He raised his hands in a placating gesture, flashing them an apologetic, charming smile that he normally reserved for his wealthiest clients. "My sister is not well. She has been struggling with some very severe psychological episodes lately. We have been trying to get her the psychiatric help she desperately needs, but as you can see, she is prone to these sudden, erratic delusions. She truly believes these wild conspiracies about our family." The guards visibly relaxed their hands, moving away from their utility belts. Trent was employing a classic manipulator tactic, isolating the target by establishing immediate rapport with the authority figures in the room. He looked the exact part of a successful burdened caretaker. He was wearing a $3,000 suit, a luxury watch, and a calm, rational expression. I, on the other hand, was standing there with messy hair, a torn dress, and a bleeding lip from where he had physically assaulted me the night before. To a total stranger, his carefully constructed narrative made complete logical sense. Our grandfather was recently diagnosed with severe late-stage dementia. Trent continued, shaking his head with practiced sadness. "It has been a living nightmare for our family. He gets confused, he wanders the house, and sometimes he writes checks to people without understanding what he is doing or what the money represents. My sister here, in her current mental state, snuck into his room last night and convinced him to hand over $60,000. We are just trying to get that invalid check back before she commits a federal crime and ruins her own life. We just want to get her home safely so she can take her medication." My mother immediately picked up on Trent's strategy and chimed in, adopting a faux maternal tone that made my stomach physically churn. "It breaks my heart to see her like this," Susan said, wiping a completely non-existent tear from her cheek for the benefit of the watching tellers. "Cassidy, please, honey, stop this embarrassment right now. You are not a forensic accountant tracking international criminals. You are just confused and exhausted. Come home with us right now before you force these nice security guards to arrest you for causing a disturbance." Trent turned his attention back to Mr. Mitchell, who was still standing paralyzed outside his office, clutching the check tightly against his chest. "Mr. Mitchell, I know this is highly irregular," Trent said, his voice dripping with professional camaraderie as he approached the bank manager. "As Winston's legal power of attorney, I must formally request that you hand that canceled check back to me immediately. It is a product of elder exploitation by an unstable family member. I will be contacting our legal team this afternoon to handle my sister's medical hold, but for now we just need to secure my grandfather's compromised assets. Hand it over, and we will get out of your hair and let you return to your business." Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting frantically around the lobby. He looked at Trent, then at my parents, and finally at me. He was a career banker, a man who survived in his industry by avoiding liability and minimizing public conflict. The pressure of the affluent family demanding compliance was immense, and Trent was offering him a very easy, quiet way out of a potentially explosive situation. But before Mitchell could extend his shaking hand to return the physical evidence to my brother, I stepped directly between the bank manager and Trent. I did not raise my voice. I did not act erratic. I squared my shoulders, wiped the last drop of dried blood from my chin, and stood with the absolute cold certainty of a professional investigator who knew the federal banking laws far better than a fraudulent wealth manager ever could. "Mr. Mitchell," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and projecting my voice so the security guards could hear every single word. Under the Bank Secrecy Act and federal regulations regarding the financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, surrendering a flagged check to a suspected perpetrator of fraud makes you a direct accessory to money laundering. If you hand that piece of paper to my brother, I will ensure federal authorities hold you accountable for facilitating the theft of $4 million. Mitchell snatched his hand back as if the paper had suddenly caught fire. He took 2 rapid steps backward, clutching the check firmly against his chest, completely retreating into the safety of his office and away from Trent. Trent watched his easy exit vanish. The charming brother facade melted away, replaced by the venomous predator I had faced the night before. His jaw clenched so tightly the muscles visibly throbbed beneath his skin. He realized he could not smooth talk his way out of this lobby. He needed to use absolute force. Trent unclasped the latches of his sleek leather briefcase, letting it fall open on a nearby glass courtesy table. He reached inside and aggressively yanked out 2 thick, stapled legal documents, slamming them down on the glass surface. He pulled a silver fountain pen from his pocket and tossed it next to the papers. "Let us drop the act, Cassidy," Trent hissed, abandoning any pretense of a polite volume. His voice echoed harshly against the marble walls. "You want to play hardball? Fine, we will play hardball. You are going to sign these right now." I glanced down at the bold, capitalized headings on the documents. The first was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, forbidding me from discussing Winston's finances, Apex Holdings, or Trent's wealth management practices, under penalty of massive financial ruin. The second document was a formal waiver of inheritance, permanently forfeiting any claim I might have to Winston's estate, effectively redirecting my entire portion straight back into Trent's greedy hands. "Sign them," Trent commanded, leaning over the glass table with a predatory smirk. "If you sign the waiver, sign the NDA, and tell Mitchell to hand me that check, I will walk out of here and leave you alone. If you refuse, I will press formal criminal charges against you for aggravated assault." I stared at him, genuinely taken aback by his sheer audacity. "Assault?" I asked, my voice laced with icy disbelief. Trent pointed directly at his own legs. "You deliberately attacked me last night. You violently kicked a heavy oak chair directly into my shins, causing physical injury before fleeing the scene of a crime. I have the medical documentation, and I have 2 eyewitnesses who will testify that you launched an unprovoked, vicious physical attack against me when I tried to stop you from robbing our grandfather." David and Susan stepped up to flank my brother, forming a united, impenetrable wall of familial betrayal. My father crossed his arms, looking at me with pure disdain. "You brought this on yourself, Cassidy," David growled. "Trent is offering you a highly generous way out. Take the deal. You sign those papers, you give your brother back his management funds, and we will not let you go to prison for battery and elder theft." My mother nodded, her eyes gleaming with toxic manipulation. "We are trying to protect you from your destructive choices," Susan added, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "You have no money for a defense attorney. You have no power here. Just sign the documents, surrender the check, and go back to your sad little apartment. It is the only way to save your future." I stood perfectly still in the center of the bank lobby, letting their vicious threats wash over me. For my entire life, I had craved their validation. I had desperately wanted my parents to look at me with the same pride and adoration they freely showered upon Trent. but standing here watching them actively blackmail me to cover up a multi-million-dollar federal crime, the final illusion completely shattered. They were not misguided. They were not simply favoring the golden child. They were active, willing participants in my destruction. The icy realization settled deep into my bones, bringing with it a profound, absolute sense of liberation. I no longer feared their rejection because I finally understood that their approval was entirely worthless. I slowly reached out and picked up the thick stack of legal documents from the glass table. Trent smirked his chest, puffing out with arrogant triumph. He thought he had won. He thought the threat of criminal charges and my parents' disappointment had finally broken my spirit. I looked Trent dead in the eyes. Then with slow, deliberate precision, I gripped the top of the stapled packets and ripped them straight down the middle. The crisp sound of tearing paper echoed in the silent lobby. Trent's smug smile vanished. My mother gasped, taking a shocked step backward. I put the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing my brother's meticulous legal blackmail into a handful of jagged, useless shreds. I dropped the destroyed documents directly at my mother's feet. The torn paper fluttered to the marble floor like dead leaves. "You can take your fake assault charges and your fraudulent waivers and choke on them," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority. "You have no power over me anymore. I am not signing anything, and I am certainly not giving you this check." I turned my back on my stunned family and walked straight toward the manager office. Mitchell was still standing just inside his doorway, watching the entire exchange with wide, terrified eyes. I held out my hand. "Give me the check, Mr. Mitchell," I demanded. "If you surrender it to them, you go down with Trent. You know exactly what a double underline means. Hand it to me right now." Right. Mitchell hesitated for only a fraction of a second. The threat of federal prison outweighed his fear of my arrogant brother. With a trembling hand, Mitchell stepped forward and placed the $60,000 check firmly into my palm. I slid the check safely back into my own pocket. Without looking back at my family, I turned and walked straight toward the bank exit. My heels clicked against the floor with powerful, rhythmic purpose. "Cassidy!" My father bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "If you walk out those doors, you are dead to this family." I pushed the heavy glass front doors open, stepping out into the bright, crisp morning air. I did not look back. I did not care. They thought I was running away, but they had absolutely no idea that I was heading straight home to my computer to trace every single stolen dollar and burn their entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. I drove back to my apartment in complete silence. The chaotic noise of the bank lobby and my parents' vicious threats faded into the background, replaced by the humming of my car engine and the singular laser-focused objective forming in my mind. When I pulled into my designated parking spot, I did not feel a single ounce of sorrow for the family I had just left behind. I marched up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment, unlocked the deadbolt, and stepped inside. I locked the door securely behind me, tossed my keys onto the kitchen counter, and walked straight into my home office. My family had spent years mocking my career. Trent loved to parade around at country club dinners, calling himself a visionary wealth manager while dismissing me as a broke, glorified calculator. My parents laughed at his jokes, genuinely believing that all I did was sit in a gray cubicle checking math errors on basic tax returns. I am a forensic accountant. I do not just count money, I hunt it down. I dismantle complex financial webs, trace hidden assets across international borders, and build airtight federal cases against white-collar criminals who think they are smarter than the system. And today, the criminal I was hunting was my own brother. I sat down in my ergonomic office chair and hit the power button on my computer tower. My dual monitors flickered to life, illuminating the dim room with a cool blue glow. I pulled the $60,000 check from my pocket, smoothing out the creases, and placed it flat on my desk directly beneath my desk lamp. I did not need access to Winston's personal bank accounts to figure out what Trent was doing. I just needed a single thread to pull. And Trent, in his arrogant desperation to bleed my grandfather dry, had handed me the perfect thread. I opened my specialized financial tracking software, a proprietary database that aggregates public corporate filings routing data and registered agent histories. I typed the 9-digit routing number and the corresponding account number printed at the bottom of the check into my system. Then I entered the name printed at the top left corner, Apex Holdings LLC. Trent thought he was a financial genius, but he was incredibly sloppy. Amateurs always assume that forming a limited liability company automatically grants them absolute invisibility. They think throwing a few corporate layers over their stolen cash acts as an impenetrable shield. But forensic accounting relies on the fact that money always leaves a digital footprint. Always. Apex Holdings, LLC was registered in Delaware, a state known for its business-friendly privacy laws. Trent clearly chose Delaware hoping to obscure the ownership records. However, he made his first massive mistake during the registration process. To maintain absolute control over the stolen funds, he listed himself as the sole managing member. He did not even bother to use a proxy or a registered agent service to hide his identity. His full legal name and his private office address were sitting right there in the open corporate registry. I leaned closer to the monitor, my fingers flying across the keyboard, as I initiated a deep dive into the corporate filings associated with his office address. If Trent was brazen enough to use his own name on the primary shell company, he was likely running a network of interconnected entities to move the stolen retirement funds. I ran a cross-reference search, looking for any other businesses registered to that exact same address or linked to his specific wealth management credentials within the last 7 months. The screen blinked, and a list of 5 different shell companies populated my secondary monitor. Summit Ventures, Pinnacle Financial, Crestview Holdings, Zenith Strategies, Apex Holdings. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Trent could not even be creative with his corporate naming conventions. He was just cycling through a thesaurus for words related to mountains and peaks. It was almost insulting how lazy he was. I began tracing the transaction histories connected to the routing numbers associated with these 5 entities. In the financial investigation world, we look for a concept called structuring. Criminals try to evade the $10,000 reporting requirement set by the federal government by breaking large sums of stolen money into smaller, less suspicious transactions. Mitchell had already confirmed that Trent was moving funds out of Winston retirement accounts in batches of $8,000 and $9,000. I needed to see exactly where those specific batches were going after they hit the Delaware shell companies. The stolen money was flowing out of Winston's legitimate retirement portfolio and dumping straight into Apex Holdings. From there, Trent was frantically shuffling the cash back and forth between the other 4 shell companies. He was executing dozens of meaningless transfers between Summit, Pinnacle, and Crestview, trying to create a chaotic financial maze that would confuse a standard auditor. He was layering the money, trying to wash off the scent of elder exploitation before he finally withdrew it for his own use. But a forensic accountant does not get confused by layering. We just follow the exit points. I isolated the outgoing wire transfers from his web of fake companies. The data showed a distinct repetitive pattern. After bouncing around between the shell entities for a few weeks, massive sums of money were being funneled outward into 2 very specific directions. The first exit point was entirely predictable. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were being wired directly into offshore accounts located in the Cayman Islands. These were high-yield, high-risk accounts, completely divorced from standard conservative retirement planning. Trent was gambling with my grandfather's life savings, desperately trying to generate massive personal returns to cover whatever hidden debts he had accumulated. But it was the second exit point that made my blood run cold and set the stage for my ultimate revenge. I stared at the secondary exit point on my monitor, tracing the digital breadcrumbs Trent had so carelessly left behind. In forensic accounting, we use a term called layering to describe moving illicit funds through complex financial transactions. The goal of layering is distancing stolen money from its original source, making it nearly impossible for a standard auditor to follow the trail. Trent had certainly tried his best to layer Winston's retirement funds. He pushed the money through those 5 Delaware shell companies, bouncing the cash back and forth like a digital pinball. However, a fraudster can layer the money 1,000 times, but eventually they have to spend it. They must pull the cash out of the virtual world and bring it into the real world. That is where the system always catches them. I opened a new spreadsheet and began mapping the exact trajectory of the second exit point. Trent was not just sending money to the Cayman Islands. He was funneling massive streams of cash directly back into the domestic banking system. But he was not putting the money into a legitimate investment portfolio for our grandfather. He was routing the funds into a series of private high-yield checking accounts, registered under his own personal Social Security number. The sheer volume of the transfers was breathtaking. I watched the numbers populate on my screen transaction by transaction. Trent was utilizing a classic structuring method, transferring the funds in precise increments of $9,900 to avoid triggering the automated currency transaction reports that banks are legally required to file with the federal government for any movement over $10,000. He thought he was outsmarting the system by flying just under the radar. What he did not realize was that repetitive transactions, just beneath the reporting threshold, trigger a different, much more dangerous alert called a suspicious activity report. He had essentially painted a giant glowing bullseye on his own financial records for any federal investigator who bothered to look. And I was looking very closely. Once I gained visibility into his personal expenditure accounts, the polished illusion of Trent, the successful wealth manager, completely shattered. My brother was not a financial prodigy. He was completely broke, drowning in a mountain of fabricated affluence. I pulled up the expense reports, my eyes narrowing as I documented his daily spending habits. The $60,000 check Winston had handed me was a drop in the bucket compared to what Trent was burning through on a monthly basis. I categorized the outgoing payments, highlighting the sheer absurdity of his lifestyle. There were massive recurring auto loan payments to a luxury dealership in downtown Chicago. The custom Porsche that my mother had bragged about, the one she claimed was the ultimate proof of his success, was entirely funded by my grandfather's stolen retirement money. There were exorbitant initiation fees and monthly dues paid to an elite members-only country club where Trent took his clients to play golf and project an aura of established wealth. The spending did not stop there. The ledger was a grotesque display of unearned luxury. I saw thousands of dollars bleeding out to high-end tailors for custom Italian suits. There were massive charges at five-star restaurants, luxury steakhouses, and exclusive cocktail lounges. He was dropping $2,000 or $3,000 on a single dinner, treating his associates and my blindly enabling parents to lavish meals, all while using stolen funds. Every single time my father proudly boasted about Trent picking up the check, Winston was the one actually footing the bill. The hypocrisy of the confrontation in the bank lobby suddenly tasted even more bitter. My parents had stood in front of a dozen strangers and screamed that I was a jealous, pathetic failure. They had humiliated me, claiming I resented Trent because he worked hard and drove a luxury car. They had fully supported him as he threatened to have me arrested for elder abuse. Meanwhile, their golden child was actively committing federal wire fraud to finance the exact lifestyle they worshipped. He was stealing the family legacy they claimed to protect to buy expensive clothes. I clicked the save button on my spreadsheet, securing the growing mountain of evidence. The case for wire fraud was absolutely airtight. To secure a federal conviction for wire fraud, the prosecution only needs to prove 2 elements. First, the defendant devised a scheme to defraud someone of money or property. Second, the defendant used interstate wire communications to execute that scheme. Trent had deliberately set up fraudulent shell companies to steal from an elderly man, and he had used digital banking networks to move the stolen cash across state lines into his own pockets. It was a textbook felony, carrying a maximum sentence of 20 years in federal prison for each transaction. I had documented over 40 separate structured transfers. Trent was looking at a potential sentence that would keep him locked behind bars for the rest of his natural life. But as I continued to scrub the data, my eyes caught a peculiar anomaly. The personal spending, the cars, the suits, the country club memberships, None of it fully accounted for the massive drain on Winston's $4 million fund. Trent was burning through cash at an alarming rate, but there were still millions of dollars missing from the overall ledger. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands held a significant chunk, but there was a massive hole in the domestic transfers. I adjusted my search parameters, widening the scope of the investigation. If the money was not sitting in Trent's personal accounts and it had not been wired overseas, it had to be parked somewhere incredibly secure. Criminals who embezzle millions rarely leave the bulk of the cash sitting in liquid form. They turn it into hard assets. They buy things that appreciate in value, things that can be easily collateralized or sold later if they need to launder the money back into the legitimate market. I ran a reverse trace on the largest outgoing wire transfers from the Apex Holdings Shell account. These were not the structured $9,000 payments. These were massive, bold, six-figure wires that bypassed his personal accounts entirely. The data loaded on my second monitor, revealing a string of routing numbers that belonged to a commercial escrow account. The money was being funneled directly into the real estate market. And the name registered to the receiving escrow account made the final devastating piece of the puzzle snap perfectly into place. The name glaring back at me from the commercial escrow account routing data was Vanguard Prestige Realty. That was not a random holding firm or an anonymous offshore trust. That was the boutique luxury real estate brokerage owned and operated entirely by my sister-in-law, Nia. I leaned back in my ergonomic office chair, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over me. Trent was not operating alone. He was not a lone wolf desperately stealing from his grandfather to cover his own personal debts. This was a coordinated, highly sophisticated criminal enterprise, and Nia was up to her elbows in stolen cash. Real estate has always been the ultimate playground for money launderers. Criminals love parking illicit funds in physical properties because it immediately legitimizes the cash. Once dirty money is converted into a luxury home, the asset can be sold, rented, or leveraged effectively, washing the funds clean and bringing them back into the legal economy. Nia, with her prestigious real estate license and access to commercial escrow accounts, provided the perfect laundering machine for Trent's embezzled millions. I opened a new tab on my browser and logged directly into the County Clerk Property Records database. As a forensic accountant, pulling public property deeds is second nature. I entered Nia's full legal name into the search bar, bypassed the standard residential listings, and filtered the results to show only commercial and luxury acquisitions finalized within the last 7 months. The exact time frame since Trent established the fake wealth management portfolio. The search results populated instantly, and the data was absolutely staggering. Nia had not just purchased one property to hide the cash. She had gone on an absolute buying spree. I clicked on the first property deed. It was a sprawling, ultra-modern penthouse located in the heart of the downtown financial district. The purchase price was listed at $1.2 million. The transaction history showed it was an all-cash offer, bypassing the mortgage approval process entirely. Criminals pay in cash because banks ask too many questions when issuing a loan. The funding source listed on the closing documents matched the massive wire transfers I had just traced out of Winston's stolen retirement accounts. I moved to the second property. It was a massive multi-level beachfront estate in an exclusive gated community, purchased just 3 months ago for a staggering $1.8 million. Again, it was an all-cash transaction, completely funded by the illicit wires routed through Vanguard Prestige Realty. The third property was a historic renovated commercial building in an up-and-coming arts district acquired for just under $900,000. Trent was draining Winston's life savings, and Nia was immediately converting those stolen dollars into an untouchable real estate portfolio. But the most arrogant, infuriating detail of the entire operation was printed right there on the official property deeds. I zoomed in on the ownership section of the legal documents. The properties were not listed under Winston's name. They were not held in a trust for the family. They were not even registered under Trent's name. Every single property was deeded exclusively to Nia. She had completely isolated the assets, putting the stolen real estate solely under her own legal ownership. My mind flashed back to the horrific confrontation in the bank lobby just hours ago, and the violent encounter in the study the night before. I remembered Nia standing in the doorway blocking my exit, her flawless makeup and designer gown, projecting an aura of absolute superiority. I remembered the vile, mocking tone of her voice as she looked down on me and called me a broke, glorified calculator. She had laughed in my face, threatening to call the police and ruin my life, all while standing on a mountain of my grandfather's stolen money. She felt entirely invincible because she believed she had successfully outsmarted the system. She thought her high society status and her real estate license made her untouchable. She assumed that a simple accountant like me would never possess the skills or the audacity to look behind the curtain of her glamorous life. She was dead wrong. By purchasing those properties in her own name using embezzled funds, Nia had elevated this entire situation from a simple case of elder financial abuse into a massive federal crime. She was actively receiving the proceeds of wire fraud and engaging in high-level money laundering. In the eyes of the federal government, this constituted a criminal conspiracy. It brought their entire operation directly under the jurisdiction of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Under RICO statutes, the federal government does not just arrest you. They seize everything you own. They freeze your bank accounts, they repossess your vehicles, and they seize every single property connected to the illicit funds. Nia thought she was building a real estate empire, but she had actually just constructed her own federal prison sentence. I highlighted the property deeds, the wire transfer logs, and the escrow account routing numbers, sending everything directly to my secure printer. The machine whirred to life, churning out page after page of undeniable, airtight evidence. I grabbed a thick red binder from my desk drawer and began meticulously assembling the forensic audit. I organized the documents chronologically, starting with Trent's fraudulent power of attorney, moving through the structured bank withdrawals, the offshore wire transfers, and finally culminating in Nia's illicit real estate purchases. Every single page was a nail in their coffin. I meticulously tabbed the sections, ensuring that any federal agent could look at this binder and instantly understand the exact flow of the stolen money. The sheer scale of their greed was breathtaking. They were perfectly willing to let Winston rot in an isolated room, stripped of his dignity and his life savings, just so Nia could play the role of a powerful real estate mogul, and Trent could pretend to be a Wall Street titan. This was no longer just a family dispute over inheritance. This was a fully documented trial, ready federal indictment wrapped in a single red binder. I placed the final summary page on top, closing the cover with a sharp, satisfying snap. As I ran my hand over the smooth cover of the binder, my cell phone buzzed violently against the surface of my desk. The sudden vibration startled me in the quiet apartment, breaking the deep silence of my concentration. I glanced over at the glowing screen. A new text message had just arrived. The sender name illuminated the dark room, and a grim, anticipatory smile crossed my face as I read the threatening words my brother had just sent me. The sender name flashing on my screen was Trent. I picked up the phone, sliding my thumb across the glass to unlock it. The message was a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation designed to inflict maximum psychological damage while asserting absolute dominance. Family meeting tonight at 8 p.m., the text read. Grandpa is going to tell you to your face what a complete disgrace you are. Come beg for forgiveness or you are dead to us. I stared at the glowing letters. In the past, a message like this would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. The threat of being excommunicated from the family combined with the terrifying prospect of a coordinated ambush in my parents' living room would have crushed me. I would have spent hours crying, agonizing over how to defend myself against their relentless gaslighting. But as I sat in the cool glow of my dual monitors with a red binder full of federal evidence resting under my fingertips, I did not feel a single ounce of fear. I felt an overwhelming surge of icy, calculated anticipation. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a hunter watching a predator walk blindly into a steel trap. Trent was entirely predictable. He was orchestrating a kangaroo court. He intended to surround himself with my enabling parents, and Nia to create an impenetrable wall of hostility. He was bringing Winston out of his isolated study to use him as a prop, fully believing that our grandfather's feigned dementia would allow Trent to put words directly into the old man's mouth. Trent wanted to force me to my knees to make me surrender the $60,000 check under the crushing weight of public familial shame. He thought he was the ultimate puppet master. He had absolutely no idea that the puppet strings had been cut the moment I stepped into Thomas Mitchell's office this morning. I set the phone down next to the red binder. I did not text Trent back. Silence is a forensic accountant's sharpest weapon. It deprives the fraudster of the feedback loop they desperately need to gauge their control. Let him sweat. Let him wonder if his intimidation tactics were working. Instead, I reached for a business card I had printed out during my deep dive into Winston's financial history. It belonged to the only man who possessed the legal authority to drop the hammer on Trent's entire operation. I dialed the number for Richard Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher was not just a standard estate attorney. He was a veteran legal shark who specialized in high net worth asset protection and complex trust litigation. My grandfather had retained his services decades ago, specifically because Gallagher had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in the courtroom. If Mitchell was the terrified banker caught in the crossfire, Gallagher was the apex predator waiting patiently in the deep water. The phone rang twice before a sharp, authoritative voice answered. Gallagher Law, this is Richard Gallagher. Mr. Gallagher, I said, keeping my tone perfectly crisp and professional. My name is Cassidy. I am Winston's granddaughter. I was at the main bank branch this morning. My grandfather handed me a check for $60,000. He signed his name and he underlined it twice. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. I could practically hear the gears turning in the seasoned lawyer's mind. When he finally spoke, the standard professional courtesy had vanished, replaced by a razor-sharp, dangerous intensity. Where are you right now? Cassidy, Mr. Gallagher asked, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register. Are you in a secure location? Is anyone from your family with you? I am alone in my apartment, I confirmed. My doors are locked. I have the physical check in my possession. Thank God, Gallagher breathed a heavy sigh of relief. Winston took a massive risk handing that to you. We have been waiting for Trent to make a fatal error, but Winston, acting as the inside man, has kept me awake for the last 3 weeks. Mitchell called me the second you walked out of the lobby this morning. He told me your family ambushed you. I need to know exactly what kind of financial data you have access to. Winston told me you were an accountant, but we need hard evidence of the embezzlement to trigger the federal freeze. I am a forensic accountant, Mr. Gallagher. I corrected him, feeling a surge of professional pride. And you do not need to wait for hard evidence. I already built the entire case. I opened the summary page of my red binder and began delivering the findings with rapid-fire precision. I did not waste time with emotional fluff. I fed him the exact data points a federal prosecutor would need to secure a grand jury indictment. Trent is utilizing a shell company called Apex Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware, I explained, reading the figures directly from my monitor. He has drained approximately $2.1 million from Winston's primary retirement accounts over the last 7 months. He is using classic structuring techniques, routing cash in batches of $9,900 to evade automatic federal reporting thresholds. He is pushing the funds through 4 secondary shell entities to layer the transactions before filtering the money into his personal high-yield checking accounts to fund luxury auto loans and exorbitant personal expenses. Gallagher let out a low whistle. He is structuring. That alone is a federal crime. But that cannot account for the full $2 million. Where is the rest of the capital parked? That is the best part, I said, allowing a cold edge of satisfaction to creep into my voice. The bulk of the stolen money is not sitting in liquid accounts. It is being wired directly into commercial escrow accounts managed by Vanguard Prestige Realty. That is the luxury brokerage firm owned entirely by my sister-in-law, Nia. She is actively laundering Winston's retirement funds. She has purchased 3 high-end properties in the last 6 months entirely in cash, and she deeded every single property exclusively under her own name. A sharp, predatory laugh echoed through the phone speaker. Mr. Gallagher sounded like a man who had just been handed the winning lottery ticket. They put the laundered assets directly into their own names, Gallagher asked, sounding almost giddy with disbelief. They tied the wire fraud directly to a licensed real estate broker, using stolen funds to buy physical property. Yes, I confirmed. I have the property deeds, the wire transfer logs, and the corporate registry files completely documented and cross-referenced. I have a 50-page forensic audit sitting on my desk, ready for the authorities. And Trent just invited me to a family meeting at my parents' house tonight at 8 o'clock. He wants to force me to sign a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of inheritance. Do not sign a single thing, Gallagher ordered, his voice ringing with absolute lethal authority. You have handed me the exact ammunition I need to execute the federal sting. Winston's distress signal activated my legal authority to move, but your forensic audit gives the feds the probable cause they need to act tonight. So, what is the play? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. The play is that you RSVP yes to your brother's little family meeting, Gallagher said, a dangerous smirk evident in his tone. You go to your parents' house tonight at 8 o'clock. You walk right into the lion's den, Cassidy. You let them talk. You let them threaten you. You keep them entirely focused on you and that check. And what will you be doing? I asked. I will be making 3 very important phone calls, Gallagher replied smoothly. 1 to a federal judge, 1 to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and 1 to the Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. You hold the room, Cassidy. I will bring the cavalry. We are going to burn Trent's fraudulent empire to the ground tonight. I ended the call and set the phone down. The trap was set. My family wanted a public execution. I was going to give them one. The drive to my parents' house took exactly 42 minutes. I pulled into the sweeping circular driveway at exactly 5 minutes to 8. The sprawling estate was brilliantly illuminated by landscape lighting, casting long dramatic shadows across the manicured lawns. I parked my 10-year-old sedan directly behind Trent's custom Porsche. The sleek sports car gleamed under the security lights. Looking at it now, knowing that the leather seats and turbocharged engine were financed entirely by stolen retirement funds, the vehicle looked less like a status symbol and more like a rolling piece of federal evidence. I grabbed my leather tote bag containing the red binder, took one final steadying breath, and stepped out into the crisp evening air. I walked up the wide stone steps and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door without knocking. The atmosphere inside the house hit me like a physical wall of suffocating smugness. Classical music drifted softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. The air smelled of expensive cedar wood and the rich, earthy notes of a high-end Cabernet Sauvignon. I walked slowly down the vaulted hallway and stepped into the expansive, sunken living room. It was a perfectly staged tableau of unearned affluence. My parents, David and Susan, were standing near the massive marble fireplace. They each held a crystal wine glass, swirling the dark red liquid with an air of absolute unbothered superiority. When I entered, they did not look relieved or concerned. They looked at me with the weary, patronizing expressions of royalty tolerating a peasant who had finally come to beg for mercy. Susan took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes scanning my simple professional attire with open disdain. She clearly expected me to walk in crying, shattered by the weight of their collective disapproval. I could see the subtle shift in her posture when she realized my face was entirely devoid of fear. David adjusted his expensive blazer, projecting the image of a disappointed patriarch, preparing to deliver a harsh but necessary punishment. They had spent the entire day convincing themselves that my actions at the bank were nothing more than a childish tantrum, a brief moment of hysterical rebellion that had now burned itself out. They fully believed I had driven over here to surrender the check and beg them to drop the fake assault charges. They thought they had won. Nia was sprawled comfortably across the length of the white leather sectional sofa. She looked like she owned the entire house, commanding the space with effortless, toxic confidence. She was wearing a stunning emerald green silk blouse that contrasted beautifully with her dark, flawless skin. She completely ignored my arrival, at first deliberately, focusing all her attention on the massive diamond engagement ring on her left hand. She held her hand up to the light, using a small microfiber cloth to lazily polish the stone. The sheer arrogance of her posture was breathtaking. She was sitting there actively laundering millions of dollars through her real estate brokerage, yet she projected the casual boredom of a queen waiting for a peasant to apologize for breathing her air. She did not even bother to look up as my footsteps echoed against the hardwood floor. Trent stood just behind the sofa, leaning against the backrest with his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He flashed me a chilling, victorious smile. He thought he had me entirely trapped. He thought his vicious text message had successfully intimidated me into absolute submission. His eyes immediately darted to the pockets of my jacket, searching for the folded slip of paper. He looked so incredibly pleased with himself, so utterly convinced of his own intellectual superiority. He had constructed a reality where he was the brilliant mastermind, and I was just the ugly, disposable problem child who needed to be crushed back into her proper place. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for me to fall to my knees. But the most disturbing part of the entire room was tucked away in the shadowy corner, deliberately positioned far from the warmth of the roaring fireplace. My grandfather Winston was confined to a bulky medical transport wheelchair. A thick, heavy plaid blanket was tucked tightly around his legs, essentially trapping him in the seat. He was staring blankly at the beige wall, his jaw slack, his hands resting limply in his lap. He looked small, fragile, and utterly lost in the absolute depths of severe dementia. The visual contrast between my vibrant, ruthless family celebrating their stolen wealth and the seemingly hollow shell of the man whose money funded it all was physically nauseating. They were treating him like a piece of broken furniture, a convenient hostage paraded out to secure my compliance. They wanted me to look at him and feel an overwhelming sense of guilt. They wanted me to believe that my refusal to cooperate was somehow harming this helpless old man. I knew it was a brilliant performance on his part. I knew his mind was as sharp as a steel trap, and that every vacant blink was carefully calculated to maintain his cover. But seeing him forced to play the victim, seeing my family actively exploit his supposed illness to justify their greed, ignited a fresh, searing wave of fury in my chest. I tightened my grip on the handle of my leather tote bag. The heavy red binder inside felt like a loaded weapon. I stood perfectly still in the center of the living room, letting the silence stretch out until the discomfort became palpable. I did not break eye contact with Trent. I did not flinch when Nia finally lowered her hand and glared at me with absolute contempt. I was exactly where I needed to be, and the trap was perfectly primed. I took a slow, measured breath, readying myself for the inevitable onslaught of their manipulation. The countdown to their complete financial and personal destruction had officially begun right now. The silence in the living room stretched thick and heavy until Trent finally broke it. He pushed himself off the back of the white leather sofa, straightening his designer tie with a sharp, arrogant tug. "I am glad you decided to be reasonable, Cassidy." Trent began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I told Mom and Dad that you would eventually come to your senses. You always do. Now take the check out of your bag and place it on the table." I did not move. I just looked at him, my face a carefully blank slate. Nia scoffed, tossing her microfiber polishing cloth onto the coffee table. She uncrossed her legs and leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at me like I was something she had just scraped off her shoe. "Did you really think your little bank stunt would work?" Nia mocked, reciting the exact lines of a bully who believed she had already won the war. "We own this family finances. You are just the ugly duckling who could not cut it." She stood up, smoothing the silk of her emerald blouse, and began to pace slowly across the expensive Persian rug. "You walked into that bank this morning thinking you were some kind of hero trying to save a senile old man. But you are completely out of your depth. Trent and I handle multi-million-dollar transactions before you even wake up to commute to your little cubicle. We manage real wealth. We build empires out of nothing. And you are a nobody, trying to play a game you do not even begin to understand. Did you really think waving a single piece of paper around would undo months of meticulous legal structuring?" Nia paused, gesturing carelessly toward Winston in the corner. "Look at him. He does not even know what day it is. He is a walking liability." If Trent had not stepped in to take control of his accounts, the state would have drained everything in medical fees and taxes. We are protecting the assets. We are the ones ensuring this family maintains its status. You should be thanking us instead of throwing pathetic tantrums in public spaces. Trent nodded in fierce agreement, stepping up to stand beside his wife. They were a unified front of absolute greed and breathtaking arrogance. Nia is entirely right, Trent added, his chest puffing out with unearned pride. I am the one keeping this family afloat. I am the one managing the investments, taking the risks, making the hard calls to secure our financial future. Do you have any idea the kind of pressure I am under to maintain our lifestyle? Of course you do not. You just sit on the sidelines seething with jealousy because I am the success story and you are the disappointment. You saw an opportunity to steal $60,000 from a confused old mind, and you took it hoping to finally get a piece of the pie you never earned. Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. But you failed, Cassidy, just like you fail at everything else. You thought you could outsmart me at the bank. I am a wealth manager. I control the narrative. I had those security guards eating out of the palm of my hand. No one is ever going to believe a hysterical broke accountant over a licensed financial professional. I hold the power of attorney. I hold the keys to the kingdom. Now give me the check and maybe I will let you walk out of here without calling the cops. They were practically handing me a verbal confession on a silver platter. They were so blinded by their own narcissism, so entirely convinced of their invincibility, that they were openly bragging about seizing control of Winston finances. They viewed my grandfather not as a human being, but as a bank vault they had successfully cracked. Before I could even formulate a response, my father stepped into the center of the room. David placed his crystal wine glass down on the mantelpiece with a sharp, angry clink. His face was set in a mask of rigid, unforgiving rage. He had listened to Trent and Nia berate me. He had listened to them admit to financially controlling his own father, and his only reaction was to nod in solemn agreement with their cruelty. "You have crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed, Cassidy," David declared, his voice echoing with absolute booming authority. "Your mother and I have spent the entire day discussing your disgusting behavior. We gave you every opportunity to be a productive, respectful member of this family, and you have thrown it all back in our faces." Susan stepped up beside him, crossing her arms tightly. "You embarrassed us in public," she hissed, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "You screamed like a lunatic in the middle of a bank lobby. You tried to ruin your brother's reputation over a petty, vindictive grudge just because you cannot afford a life like his." And because of that, David interrupted, his tone turning ice cold. "I called my lawyers this afternoon. You are officially cut out of the will. Every single cent, every property, every asset that your mother and I own will go exclusively to Trent and Nia. You will not see a single dime of our money." He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, expecting me to shatter. He wanted me to fall to my knees and beg. He wanted me to cry and apologize for threatening their perfect financial ecosystem. "There is only one way you are walking out of this house tonight without me pressing charges for corporate espionage and theft," David demanded, pointing a rigid finger at the floor in front of Trent. "You will hand that check to your brother, and then you will look him in the eye and apologize. You will apologize to Trent, you will apologize to Nia, and you will apologize to your mother and me for your disgusting behavior. Do it now." I stood in the center of the room, clutching my leather tote bag. The final bridge had just been burned to ashes. My father had just disowned me to protect a son who was actively committing federal wire fraud. My mother had cheered him on. They had chosen their side with absolute, unwavering finality. They did not care about the truth. They only cared about the illusion of their superiority. I looked at David, my face completely devoid of emotion. I looked at Susan, who was waiting eagerly for my tears. I looked at Nia, who was smirking in triumph, and Trent, who held his hand out expectantly for the check. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute power of the red binder resting safely inside my bag. I did not fall to my knees. I did not shed a single tear over being cut out of a will that had just been used as a weapon against me. Instead, I unzipped the heavy brass closure of my leather tote bag. The sharp metallic sound cut through the silence of the living room like a knife. I reached inside, gripping the thick spine of the red binder I had meticulously assembled just hours ago. Trent extended his hand further, his arrogant smirk returning. He assumed I was finally reaching for the $60,000 check. He thought my silence was the ultimate sign of my submission. I pulled the 50-page forensic audit from my bag. I lifted it high and slammed it down onto the center of the glass coffee table with every ounce of force I could muster. The explosive crash echoed like a gunshot. The heavy crystal wine glasses on the table rattled violently against the glass surface. My mother jumped back with a startled shriek, clutching her chest. Trent snatched his hand away as if he had been burned. "What is this garbage?" Trent demanded, his voice cracking slightly, the first genuine hint of uncertainty bleeding through his polished facade. "That is your entire life burning to the ground," I stated, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered authority. "I did not come here to apologize, Trent. I came here to deliver your federal indictment." I flipped open the heavy red cover. The first page displayed a massive, undeniable flowchart tracking every single stolen dollar. I looked directly into my brother's widening eyes. "You love calling me a glorified calculator." I continued, stepping around the table to stand directly in his space. "Let us do some math, wealth manager. 7 months ago, you marched into Mr. Mitchell's bank and forged a power of attorney. You set up a shell company in Delaware called Apex Holdings LLC. From there, you created a web of meaningless corporate entities. Summit Ventures, Pinnacle Financial, Crestview Holdings, Zenith Strategies. You thought using a thesaurus for mountain names made you a financial genius. It just made you a predictable amateur." My father stepped forward, his face red. "Cassidy, stop this nonsense right now." I held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "I am not finished, David. You want to know how your golden son affords his lifestyle? Let me tell you. Trent has been systematically draining Winston's $4 million retirement fund. He is using a technique called structuring, moving exactly $9,900 at a time to evade federal currency reporting thresholds. He is terrified of triggering an automatic flag, but his repetitive withdrawals generated a massive suspicious activity report anyway." Trent's jaw actually dropped. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, chalky white. He stumbled backward, his knees hitting the edge of the white leather sofa. He looked like a man watching an oncoming train. He took Winston's money and wired hundreds of thousands into high-risk offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I practically growled, slamming my finger against a highlighted bank statement in the binder. The rest of the cash went straight into his personal high-yield checking accounts. That custom Porsche in the driveway. Stolen money. The Italian suits. Stolen money. The country club where you show him off to your friends. All of it was bought with blood money stolen directly from the man sitting in the corner of this room. My mother gasped, looking frantically between me and Trent. "Trent, tell her she is lying." Susan pleaded, her voice shaking. "Tell her this is a mistake." Trent could not speak. His chest was heaving, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the undeniable proof of his federal wire fraud sat exposed on the table. But I was not done. I turned my attention away from my hyperventilating brother and locked my gaze entirely onto my sister-in-law. Nia was still sitting on the sofa, but her previous posture of regal superiority had completely evaporated. She was clutching her emerald silk blouse, her dark eyes wide with sudden gripping terror. "You thought you were untouchable, Nia," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously calm whisper. "You thought you could hide behind your luxury real estate license and laugh at me while helping your husband commit a felony. You are not just a bystander. You are the washing machine." Nia swallowed hard, shaking her head. "I do not know what you are talking about. I run a legitimate brokerage. Vanguard Prestige. Realty is a money laundering front," I declared, flipping to the final devastating section of the binder. "You used commercial escrow accounts to funnel Winston's stolen retirement funds straight into the real estate market. You wanted to clean the dirty cash, so you went on a shopping spree. Would you like me to read the addresses for the room?" Nia opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Let us start with the ultra-modern penthouse in the financial district I recited flawlessly from memory, my eyes piercing right through her. $1.2 million. Paid in full. All cash offer. Then there is the beachfront estate in the gated community. $1.8 million. All cash. And let us not forget the historic commercial building in the Arts District for $900,000. All cash. All funded by illicit wires from Apex Holdings. The sheer silence in the living room was absolute. My parents were paralyzed, their mouths hanging open in horror as the true scale of the criminal enterprise was laid bare before them. But the best part, Nia, the part that proves exactly how arrogant and greedy you truly are, is the ownership records. I continued leaning down until my face was only inches from hers. You did not put those properties in a trust. You did not even put Trent's name on the deeds. You registered every single one of those stolen properties exclusively under your own legal name. You tied the embezzled funds directly to your own social security number. Nia let out a strangled, breathless gasp. Her hands began to shake violently. All the beautiful glowing color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and sick. By receiving the proceeds of federal wire fraud and converting them into real estate, you have triggered the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Why explained, delivering the killing blow with absolute clinical precision. Under RICO statutes, the federal government will not just arrest you. They will freeze your brokerage accounts, strip your real estate license, and seize every single property you own. You built your entire luxury empire with stolen money, and now the federal government is going to take it all away. You are going to lose everything, Nia. Absolutely everything. Nia buried her face in her hands, letting out a sharp, panicked sob. The fierce, mocking woman who had blocked my exit and threatened to call the police on me last night was completely broken, reduced to a trembling, terrified mess on the white leather sofa. Trent finally found his voice. It was a weak, pathetic croak. "You cannot prove this," he stammered, stepping toward the table with a shaking hand. "I am taking this binder. You hacked my private files. That is illegal." I laughed, a harsh, victorious sound that cut through his desperate delusion. "You really think this is the only copy, Trent?" I mocked, stepping back from the table. "I am a forensic accountant. I secured the data on 3 separate encrypted cloud servers before I even left my apartment. I have digital trails, IP logs, and verified routing numbers. It is a fully documented trial-ready federal indictment. You cannot destroy the evidence because the evidence is already everywhere." The reality of their absolute destruction finally settled over the room. Trent collapsed onto the arm of the sofa, clutching his head. Nia was openly weeping. My parents stood frozen, their perfect world completely shattered by the undeniable weight of a 50-page document. I held all the power, and they finally knew it. Or so I thought. I had critically underestimated the bottomless depths of my parents' toxic delusion. For a normal, rational human being, a comprehensive forensic audit complete with bank routing numbers and property deeds would be absolute, undeniable proof of a crime. But Susan and David were not rational people. They had spent the last 3 decades meticulously constructing a flawless upper-class reality where Trent was the undisputed golden child. Acknowledging that he was a federal criminal meant acknowledging that their entire parenting philosophy was a catastrophic failure. And my mother would literally rather watch the world burn than admit she was wrong. Susan violently broke the heavy silence. She stepped away from my father, her chest heaving as she pointed a shaking finger at the red binder resting on the glass table. "This is a complete fabrication," Susan shrieked. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, sharp and desperate. "You made all of this up, Cassidy. You sat in your sad little apartment and you printed out fake spreadsheets just to frame your own brother." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer velocity of her denial. "Mom? The wire transfer logs are certified public records," I replied, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "You cannot fake a commercial real estate deed registered with the county clerk." "I do not care about your fake documents," Susan yelled, stepping closer and waving her hands frantically in the air. "You have always been insanely jealous of Trent. You could never handle the fact that he is charming, successful, and married to a beautiful woman. You have been plotting to destroy him out of pure spite since the day he bought his first luxury car. You are a sick, vindictive girl who cannot stand to see anyone else happy. David quickly rallied behind his wife. My father had always enabled my mother's worst impulses, and right now, he was actively choosing to bury his head in the sand. He refused to even look down at the binder on the coffee table. He puffed out his chest, stepping in front of Trent, as if shielding him from a physical threat. Your mother is absolutely right. David barked, his face twisting into a mask of pure indignation. You hacked into your brother's private business files and manipulated the data to create a false narrative. That is corporate espionage, Cassidy. That is cyber terrorism. I almost laughed out loud at his ridiculous choice of words. Cyber terrorism, Dad, I asked. I used a public corporate registry database. He listed himself as the sole managing member of a money laundering shell company. It took me less than 5 minutes to find it because your genius son is a lazy amateur. Shut your mouth, David roared, taking an aggressive step toward me. You are not a federal agent. You are just a bitter accountant who crossed a massive legal line. I am calling the police right now. I am going to have you arrested for hacking into a private wealth management firm. I will personally ensure the state board strips you of your accounting license. You will never work in the financial sector again. I will make sure you spend the next 10 years in a prison cell for trying to extort your own family. I watched them double down on their toxic reality, and any lingering shred of hope I had for my family evaporated. They were willing to sacrifice my freedom and my professional reputation just to keep pretending their son was a respectable businessman. They were willing to let my grandfather die penniless to maintain their country club status. The realization settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket of ice. Nia continued to sob quietly on the sofa, her hands covering her face because she knew the truth. She knew the deeds were real. But Trent was watching our parents with a newfound desperate glimmer of hope. Trent fed off their aggressive denial. He realized that as long as David and Susan were willing to blindly reject the evidence, he still had a microscopic window of opportunity to eliminate the immediate threat. He knew I had digital backups. He knew the cloud servers were secure. But in his panicked, adrenaline-fueled state, logic completely abandoned him. All he saw was the physical red binder sitting on the table and the sister who had dared to challenge his authority standing just a few feet away. I saw his eyes shift. I recognized the dangerous, predatory tightening of his jaw and the way his shoulders dropped as he braced his weight. His expensive suit jacket strained across his back. Trent was completely unhinged. The charm was gone. The fake wealth manager persona was entirely erased. He was just a violent, cornered animal preparing to strike his prey. Trent let out a primal, furious scream. He lunged across the space between the sofa and the coffee table, his expensive dress shoes slipping slightly on the rug. He did not go for the binder. He came directly for me. His hands curled into tight, heavy fists, and his face was twisted into a grotesque mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He intended to beat me unconscious right there on the living room floor, fully believing our parents would stand by and let him do it. I braced myself, my muscles tensing as I prepared to dodge his incoming assault. He crossed the distance in a fraction of a second, his arm pulling back to deliver a devastating blow to my head. He was mere inches away. I could literally feel the air displacement from his fist swinging toward my face. And then the sound tore through the house. It was not a polite ring of the doorbell. It was a heavy, thunderous, authoritative pounding against the solid mahogany of the front door. The sheer force of the knocks echoed down the vaulted hallway and reverberated through the floorboards of the sunken living room. It was a rhythmic, commanding series of strikes that demanded absolute immediate compliance. Trent froze in midair. His fist stopped mere inches from my jaw. The sudden explosive noise completely shattered his violent momentum. My mother shrieked, clutching her chest again. My father spun around, staring down the hallway toward the foyer with wide, startled eyes. Nia stopped crying, dropping her hands from her face to stare toward the entrance in pure, paralyzed terror. The pounding came again, louder, harder, unforgiving. The heavy pounding echoed again, rattling the expensive artwork hanging on the foyer walls. David finally broke his paralyzed stance. He smoothed the lapels of his designer jacket, adopting his usual mask of suburban authority, and marched down the hallway. He fully intended to yell at whoever had the audacity to disturb his home at this hour. I remained standing perfectly still, watching from the living room as my father yanked the front door open. David opened his mouth to deliver a scathing reprimand, but the words died instantly in his throat. Stepping across the threshold was a man who commanded absolute, undeniable authority. Mr. Gallagher wore a pristine charcoal suit carrying a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had dismantled countless corporate empires. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his piercing gray eyes immediately scanned the foyer with the calculating precision of a seasoned predator. He did not wait for an invitation. He simply walked into the house, forcing my father to step backward. But Mr. Gallagher was not alone. Filing in directly behind him were 4 individuals who completely shattered the polished, wealthy illusion of my parents' home. 3 men wore dark utilitarian windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back spelling out FBI. They moved with coordinated tactical efficiency, fanning out into the hallway and establishing immediate control over the space. The 4th person was a stern-looking woman in a sharp navy blazer holding a thick stack of official federal folders. The silver badge clipped to her belt identified her as a lead investigator for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My mother let out a strangled gasp, dropping her wine glass onto the plush carpet. The crystal shattered, splashing dark red stains across the white fibers. Susan stumbled backward, pressing her hands over her mouth in sheer terror. Nia shrank down into the cushions of the leather sofa, pulling her knees to her chest, her arrogant facade completely dissolving into a state of visible, trembling panic. "What is the meaning of this?" David finally stammered, his voice stripped of all its former booming power. "Who are you people, and how dare you force your way into my home? I demand you leave immediately, or I will call the police." One of the FBI agents stepped forward, flashing his credentials directly in my father's face. "We are the police, sir. Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant to secure these premises and all individuals present. I suggest you remain completely silent and let the attorney speak." Mr. Gallagher ignored my parents entirely. He walked smoothly into the sunken living room, his sharp gaze bypassing Trent and landing directly on me. He offered me a curt, respectful nod. "Good evening, Cassidy," Mr. Gallagher said, his voice projecting a calm, lethal confidence that filled the massive room. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but securing federal warrants requires a certain level of theatricality. You held the room perfectly." Trent stood frozen near the coffee table. His fists had uncurled and his arms hung limply at his sides. He looked back and forth between the federal agents and the estate lawyer, his mind desperately trying to process the catastrophic collapse of his reality. He took a shaky step forward, attempting to summon his fake wealth manager persona one last time. "I am Trent," he announced, his voice cracking noticeably. "I hold the legal power of attorney for my grandfather Winston. I am the sole manager of his financial estate. Whatever you think is going on here, I have the absolute authority to handle it. I demand you direct all inquiries to my legal counsel." Mr. Gallagher turned slowly to face my brother. The lawyer expression was devoid of any warmth or professional courtesy. He looked at Trent the way one might look at a particularly unpleasant insect. "You do not have a legal team that can save you from this," Mr. Gallagher stated flatly. "And your power of attorney was rendered entirely null and void the moment you committed federal wire fraud." Trent swallowed, hard sweat beading on his forehead. "I have not committed any fraud. Every transfer was a legitimate tax strategy. I was protecting the assets." "That is a fascinating defense," Mr. Gallagher replied smoothly, setting his leather briefcase down right next to my red binder on the coffee table. "However, you seem to have fundamentally misunderstood the events of this morning. You thought Cassidy intercepting a $60,000 check was a random act of theft. You thought she was a desperate, jealous sister trying to steal from a confused old man." Gallagher unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a high-resolution printed copy of the exact check I had carried to the bank. He held it up for Trent, Nia, and my parents to see. "This check was never a gift," Mr. Gallagher revealed, his voice slicing through the tense air like a scalpel. "And it was certainly never a mistake caused by dementia. This piece of paper was a highly calibrated, custom-designed piece of federal bait." The color drained completely from Trent's face. His eyes locked onto the printed image of the check, specifically staring at the double underline beneath Winston's signature. "When you marched into the bank lobby this morning," Gallagher explained with ruthless clarity, "you did exactly what we needed you to do. By demanding that Mr. Mitchell hand the check over to you, and by publicly asserting your absolute control over the Apex Holdings account in front of federal bank cameras and sworn security personnel, you legally and physically tied yourself directly to a fraudulent shell company. You claimed ownership of an illicit entity used for money laundering." My mother let out a quiet, terrified whimper, finally realizing the inescapable magnitude of the trap her golden child had walked right into. "We knew you were structuring withdrawals." The IRS investigator stepped forward, taking over the explanation with cold, bureaucratic precision. "We knew you were transferring funds just under the $10,000 threshold. But federal prosecutors need concrete proof that the individual executing the digital transfers is the same person claiming physical authority over the stolen assets. You gave us that proof on a silver platter this morning. Your public confrontation at the bank provided the exact probable cause required to authorize a sweeping federal mandate." Trent stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the sofa. He dropped down next to Nia, gasping for air, as the reality of his situation crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. "What does that mean?" David asked, his voice barely a whisper, looking at the IRS agent with wide, fearful eyes. "It means the trap snapped shut an hour ago," Mr. Gallagher answered, turning back to my father. "A federal judge signed the emergency injunctions this afternoon. As of this exact moment, every single bank account registered to your son is completely frozen. The offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands have been flagged by international authorities. Furthermore, the commercial escrow accounts linked to Vanguard Prestige Realty have been seized by the federal government." Nia let out a sharp, agonizing cry, clutching her stomach as the mention of her brokerage firm confirmed her absolute destruction. "You have zero access to liquid capital," Gallagher concluded, looking down at Trent with pure disdain. "You cannot move a single cent. You cannot hire a defense attorney with stolen money. The game is entirely over. You took the bait and you swallowed the hook." The suffocating silence that followed Mr. Gallagher's declaration was broken by a sound that completely defied the reality my parents had constructed. It was a sharp metallic click, followed by the distinct rustle of heavy fabric. Everyone in the living room instinctively turned their heads toward the shadowy corner, where my grandfather had been parked like a discarded piece of furniture. The thick plaid blanket that had been tightly tucked around Winston's legs was suddenly thrown to the floor. The swift, aggressive movement startled my mother so badly she let out a short, high-pitched gasp. We all watched in absolute, paralyzed disbelief as Winston gripped the armrests of his medical transport wheelchair. He did not tremble. He did not struggle. With a fluid, powerful motion that belied his 82 years, my grandfather pushed himself up and stood perfectly straight. The hunched, fragile posture of a severely cognitively impaired elder vanished instantly. He rolled his shoulders back, expanding his chest, and took a slow, deliberate step forward into the bright illumination of the living room overhead lights. His eyes, which had spent the last 8 months staring blankly at walls and floors, were now blazing with a sharp, lethal glare that commanded absolute submission from everyone in the room. "Dad?" David whispered, his voice trembling with sheer shock. He took a hesitant step toward his father, reaching out a shaking hand. "What are you doing? You need to sit down. You are going to hurt yourself." Winston did not even look at his son. He swatted David's outstretched hand away with a violent, dismissive swipe. "Do not touch me," Winston commanded. His voice was a booming, resonant baritone entirely stripped of the raspy, confused weakness he had been feigning for months. It was the voice of the ruthless corporate titan who had built a $4 million empire from scratch. Trent shrank back against the white leather sofa, instinctively pressing himself closer to Nia. His jaw hung open. He looked back and forth between Mr. Gallagher and the imposing figure of his grandfather, his mind utterly incapable of processing the monumental deception that had just been revealed. "You are not sick," Trent stammered, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. "You remember everything." "I remember absolutely every single detail," Winston replied, taking another slow, measured step toward his grandson. "I remember exactly what day it is. I remember every single dollar I earned. And I remember exactly what it felt like to sit in that wheelchair for 8 agonizing months, listening to my own flesh and blood openly plot to strip my accounts bare." Susan pressed her hands against her cheeks, shaking her head frantically. "This cannot be real," she murmured. "The doctors diagnosed you. We saw the medical reports. We watched you lose your memory. You saw exactly what I paid the absolute best private neurologists in the state to let you see." Winston corrected her, his tone dripping with icy contempt. "I knew Trent was drowning in debt. I saw the aggressive financial moves he was trying to make behind my back. I knew he was desperate for liquid cash to fund his pathetic, flashy lifestyle. But I also knew that if I simply fired him as my wealth manager, you and David would endlessly defend him. You would have fought me in court, dragged my name through the mud, and petitioned for a legal conservatorship just to protect your precious golden boy." Winston stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the coffee table, towering over Trent and Nia. "So I decided to give him exactly what he wanted." Winston continued, his eyes narrowing into a dangerous squint. "I faked the dementia. I locked myself in that study and let my brain supposedly rot. I handed over the keys to my kingdom just to see exactly how far you would go. I wanted to see if there was any shred of decency left in you, Trent. I wanted to see if you would manage the funds ethically, or if you would take advantage of a helpless old man." Winston leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the glass coffee table right next to the red binder I had compiled. "And you took the bait with breathtaking greed." Winston snarled, his voice rising in volume. "You did not just mismanage my money. You systematically pillaged my life savings. You set up shell companies. You bought luxury cars. You colluded with your wife to launder my hard-earned wealth through commercial real estate, completely confident that I would die in that corner before I ever noticed a single missing dime." Trent tried to speak, tried to formulate a defense, but no words came out. He was completely defeated, crushed under the absolute terrifying weight of Winston's calculated wrath. My grandfather finally turned away from Trent and looked directly at me. The harsh, lethal anger in his eyes melted away, replaced by an expression of profound, overwhelming respect. He walked around the glass table and stopped right in front of me. "I am so sorry I had to put you through this, Cassidy," Winston said softly, his tone completely shifting. "I hated watching them treat you like dirt. I hated sitting in that chair while they insulted your career and mocked your independence. But I needed a trigger. I needed someone entirely outside of Trent's fraudulent ecosystem to execute the final phase of the sting operation." He placed a warm, steady hand on my shoulder. "I used you to deliver the final nail in their coffin because you are the only one in this entire house with a spine," Winston declared, his voice ringing with absolute pride. "I knew you were smart enough to recognize a distress signal. I knew your background in forensic accounting would force you to look at the routing numbers on that check. I knew you would never blindly hand the money over to Trent no matter how much David and Susan screamed at you in that bank lobby. You have more integrity, more intelligence, and more courage in your little finger than this entire pathetic family possesses combined." My vision blurred with sudden, unexpected tears. For 32 years, I had been the family's scapegoat. I had been called a disappointment, an ugly duckling, and a glorified calculator. My own parents had cut me out of their will just an hour ago for refusing to comply with their toxic demands. But hearing my grandfather, the man who had orchestrated this brilliant multi-million-dollar federal sting, validate my worth in front of the people who had tried to destroy me, was the most profoundly satisfying moment of my entire life. Winston turned back to face David and Susan, who were now trembling near the fireplace, fully realizing the catastrophic scale of their failure. "Cassidy is the true legacy of this family," Winston stated, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "The rest of you are nothing but parasites." And tonight, the host is finally cutting you off. Mr. Gallagher gave a sharp nod to the federal agent standing at the edge of the living room. The lead FBI agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. He grabbed Trent by the shoulders, spinning him around and forcefully kicking his legs apart. Trent offered no physical resistance. He simply stared blankly at the floor as the cold metal clamped tightly around his wrists. Trenton Hayes. The agent declared, his voice ringing with absolute authority. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. While Trent surrendered to the crushing reality of his consequences, Nia completely lost her mind. The IRS investigator stepped toward her, holding a pair of heavy zip ties. Nia shrieked violently, thrashing her arms and kicking her expensive heels against the white leather sofa. "Get your hands off me!" Nia screamed, her flawless facade entirely shattered. "I am a licensed real estate broker. I did not do anything wrong. Trent lied to me." Two additional agents immediately swarmed the sofa, pinning Nia's arms behind her back with brutal efficiency. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit money laundering and multiple violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the investigator stated coldly, hauling Nia to her feet. Your brokerage assets have already been seized. My mother collapsed onto the floor, wailing uncontrollably as the agents dragged Trent and Nia toward the front door. David rushed forward, his face pale with terror. He grabbed Mr. Gallagher by the sleeve of his tailored suit, his previous arrogance replaced by desperate, pathetic pleading. "Richard, please stop this," David begged, his voice cracking. "We can fix this quietly. We can pay the money back. Do not let them take my son." Mr. Gallagher calmly brushed my father's hand off his jacket. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a slim manila folder, pressing it directly into David's trembling chest. "You cannot pay anything back." "David," Mr. Gallagher replied with lethal precision, "open the folder." My father flipped the cover open, his eyes scanning the documents inside. His jaw slackened, and he staggered backward as if he had been physically struck. "Did you really think Trent financed his fraudulent shell companies and offshore transfers with air?" Mr. Gallagher asked, his tone dripping with mockery. "Your son needed massive collateral to secure those initial high-yield loans. He brought you the paperwork, and because you blindly trusted your golden child, you and Susan approved every single fraudulent credit line." Susan gasped, crawling across the rug to look at the papers in David's shaking hands. "The banks are calling in the debts tomorrow morning," Gallagher concluded smoothly. "Your luxury home is serving as the primary collateral. You will be foreclosed on by the end of the month. You are completely and permanently bankrupt." My mother let out a guttural wail, finally realizing the sheer inescapable gravity of Mr. Gallagher's words. The luxurious, untouchable life she had worshipped far above her own daughter was evaporating right before her eyes. Susan collapsed onto the ruined Persian rug, the spilled red wine soaking deeply into the knees of her expensive designer trousers. She crawled across the floor toward me, her shaking hands desperately reaching out to grab the hem of my torn dress. "Cassidy, please." My mother sobbed, her dark mascara running in thick, ugly streaks down her pale face. "You have a good professional job. You make a steady salary. You have to help us pay off the banks. You can take out a loan or use your savings to stop the foreclosure. We are your parents. You cannot just let them throw us out on the street." I looked down at the pathetic woman who had just publicly disowned me, who had smiled while her golden son slapped me, and who had spent 32 years making me feel completely worthless. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I deliberately stepped back, pulling my dress entirely out of her desperate, clutching grasp. "I am just a broke, glorified calculator, remember?" I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing finality. "I do not have the funds to save you." I turned my back on my weeping parents and the federal agents dismantling their lives. My grandfather gripped the handles of his wheelchair, but he did not sit back down. Instead, Winston walked proudly by my side, leaving the heavy mahogany doors wide open as we stepped out into the crisp, liberating night air together. 6 months later, the dust had completely settled. The federal justice system does not move quickly, but it moves with absolute crushing certainty. Trent and Nia were both swiftly denied bail. They are currently sitting in federal holding facilities facing a mandatory minimum of a decade in federal prison for wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering violations. Their entire fake empire was permanently seized by the government to pay restitution. David and Susan lost the mansion in less than 30 days. Stripped of their stolen wealth and their precious country club status, they were forced to move into a cramped, rundown one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. My phone block list is full of their desperate pleading voicemails, all of which I delete without ever listening. I am sitting in the corner office of my own newly opened forensic accounting firm. The space is bright, modern, and entirely funded by my own hard work with a small angel investment from a very grateful grandfather. Winston is sitting across from my desk right now, sipping a black coffee and looking healthier than he has in a decade. They thought a slap would break me, but they forgot. When you corner a woman with nothing left to lose, she does not cry, she calculates. Has a family member ever underestimated your intelligence? Tell me your story in the comments and hit subscribe for more justice. The story of Cassidy and her family's catastrophic betrayal reveals a powerful truth about navigating toxic environments. Composure and self-reliance are the ultimate shields against manipulation. For decades, Cassidy desperately sought validation from parents who only valued the superficial success of her deceitful brother. When violently pushed to the absolute brink, she did not crumble into the emotional wreckage they eagerly anticipated. Instead, she leaned heavily into her professional expertise as a forensic accountant. This deeply resonates, teaching us that our inherent skills and logical clarity can gracefully dismantle the most elaborate webs of gaslighting, financial abuse, and fraud. Furthermore, family loyalty is often weaponized by those who view relationships as purely transactional. Cassidy's parents and brother weaponized guilt, public shaming, and physical intimidation to force her compliance. The profound lesson here is that sharing DNA does not obligate anyone to endure relentless emotional abuse. True liberation begins the very moment we stop trying to prove our inherent worth to people who are entirely committed to misunderstanding us. By refusing to sign away her rights and choosing to methodically expose the multi-million-dollar embezzlement, Cassidy shattered a generational cycle of enabling behavior. She recognized that her true value was not dictated by her parents' cruel metrics, but by her own uncompromising integrity and relentless hard work. Ultimately, the narrative demonstrates that the best response to pure malice is not blind vengeance, but absolute justice achieved through unshakable, permanent boundaries. Cassidy simply allowed her family's unchecked greed to become their own ultimate undoing, proving that walking away is the most powerful move imaginable. We must consistently recognize our own strength and never let fear keep us tethered. Take a moment today to evaluate the boundaries in your own life and bravely step away from anyone who diminishes your worth.